Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, it's a little bit of technical difficulties, but we're getting started on time. So my name is Jacob Stock. I'm here to introduce a presentation by John Hester. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. And this presentation is on TRPA 101, the foundations of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and our planning system, and how these relate to planning for affordable and workforce housing. We have about a half hour for presentations and then another half hour for questions following the presentation. So I'll be moderating those questions and answers for our discussion. So let's do a quick sound check. Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, and
Okay.
V confirmed that she could hear before.
And V can hear. Perfect. Okay, so I want to start off by introducing some faces you'll see in the presentation. When I say your name, please unmute and just say hi so people know who you are. The first is Sandra Rentas. She's our interpreter.
You won't be able to hear Sandra.
That's right. Okay, so it's working then. The next is Jessica Gillies. She'll be running the slides for the presentation.
Hi, everyone.
And then Ken Caspin, Ali Borowski, and Karen Fink are here to help answer your questions.
Hi.
All right, thanks all. Next slide.
Can you hear me? No? Sorry, Jacob, to interrupt. I was assigned as an interpreter, so I wasn't sure. I don't want to talk on top of you.
No, that's fine. Is the interpretation channel working?
It still does.
I rejoined
No.
as an interpreter, so I think they have to assign me as I don't know. That's what I think. Sorry for the.
So Sandra's language is set to English. Should I change it to Spanish?
Yes.
Okay, that should have changed it.
Well, you guys figure that out. We'll run through the technicalities here. So this presentation was noticed as a meeting of the Tahoe Living Working Group. This is an optional meeting for that group, but we still have some formal items to complete before we can start the presentation. Can you go to the next slide, please, Jessica? So I'd like to call this meeting of the Tahoe Living Working Group to order. The date is January 27th, and the time is 2:04 p.m. Next slide, please. We'll do a quick roll call. So working group members, when you hear your name, please unmute yourself and say here. After roll, we'll put working group members back in attendee mode, so you'll have time. You'll have full access to the question and answer tools. So I'll get started on roll call. Alexis Hill. Yeah.
Here.
Courtney Weike.
Here.
Daniel Huerta.
Here.
Einad Jaran-Lot.
Here.
Elizabeth Ballman.
Here.
Erica Gonzalez.
Here.
Gavin Feiger.
Here.
James McNamara.
Here.
Christina Kind.
Here.
Rob Olson.
Here.
Sophia Heidrich.
Here.
Vince Henigman.
Here.
Wow, great attendance, everyone. Way to go. Are there any working group members that I didn't call on? I think we got everyone. Okay. Next slide. Let's see, Daisy. Okay. So if you'd like Spanish interpretation for this meeting, we'll have live interpretation. Please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should by now be able to see a language there. Maybe it probably says English for you. That's the default. Oh, can you go back one slide, please? I'm sorry. But you can click on that and you can switch to Spanish if you would like Spanish interpretation. You also have a closed caption option at the bottom of your screen that you can click on as well. If you're joining us by phone, please dial *9 to raise your hand and *6 to toggle mute and unmute. For everyone else, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to enter questions. You can do it at any time. Please don't use the chat function. We're trying to stick to Q&A for this webinar. And a reminder that this presentation is being recorded, so just so you're aware, and it will be posted on tahoeliving.org when we're finished. Next slide, please. So this presentation is part of Cultivating Community Conserving the Basin, a multi-year planning and policy project aimed at improving access to affordable and workforce housing while protecting the environment, and with a special focus on building a more equitable growth management system and development fees. Cultivating Community is the current phase of our Tahoe Living program, which you'll hear more about later in this presentation. This presentation is meant to provide an overview of TRPA to help you engage with Cultivating Community and with regional planning efforts more generally. We won't cover everything today. I want to be very clear about that. This is just the first part in an educational series that will cover a range of topics. Our Planning 101 presentation is set for February 10th at 3 p.m. and you can expect a presentation on growth management in late March. We welcome your suggestions for future presentations as well, and there will be a survey at the end where you can give your suggestions. This series was designed for our Tahoe Living Working Group members and community partner group in mind, but as our target audience, but anyone is encouraged to join and participate equally in the discussion. And so with that, I will hand it off to John Hester.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Jacob. Before I tell you about TRPA, I want to acknowledge the Washoe. The Tahoe is the homeland of the Washoe people, the people who are here from here. The Washoe are the Aboriginal stewards of the land in and around the Lake Tahoe Basin. And as a sovereign nation, the Washoe, known as the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, they continue to advocate for the protection and preservation and work with us as valued partners. Next slide. So to understand why TRPA was created, it's important to provide a little context. First, the basin was heavily logged in the 1800s to provide timber for the silver mines in Virginia City. And as a result, the forest around the lake is much less diverse in terms of species and age and more vulnerable. Second, many vacation cabins were built in the 1950s and 60s. Casinos were built, and Tahoe was discovered by the world when the 1960 Winter Olympics were held at what is now known as Palisades, Tahoe. And then third, as a result of those things, the lake was impacted by the construction of roads, vehicle emissions, septic tank effluent, increased erosion and runoff, causing significant water quality and air quality degradation. Next slide. So to address those impacts, the states of California and Nevada used the provision of the U.S. Constitution allowing bi-state compacts to create the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. The compact was supported by Governors Reagan and Laxalt, the governors of California and Nevada at the time, and approved by both state legislatures, the U.S. Congress, and the President. Next. So the compact is included in both states' laws and federal law. It provides authority to TRPA that supersedes some state laws, but does not exempt the local governments from the laws in their respective states. For example, the requirements of California laws on housing apply to local governments on the California side of the basin, and the requirements of TRPA code on housing apply to local governments on both sides of the basin. In addition, local governments can adopt their own regulations covering the same topics as TRPA code, but the stricter of the two applies. Next slide. With that, TRPA was established. Today, we lead the cooperative effort to preserve and restore and enhance the unique natural and human environment of the Lake Tahoe region. That's our mission statement. Next. So a little bit about the governing board. It's made up of 15 members. plus one additional member when it acts as the Tahoe Metropolitan Transportation Planning Organization, which is the federal designation for transportation planning and funding. The makeup of the board is shown on the slide. The 6 local government representatives are from the 5 counties and the 1 city in the basin, 3 from each state. The local government representatives are the only members allowed to live in the Tahoe Basin. All others must live outside the basin. 2 of the 4 state representatives from California are appointed by the governor, 1 by the Senate, and 1 by the Assembly. The Nevada representatives are the Secretary of State, 1 appointee of the governor, the Director of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, who is also appointed by the governor, and a 4th member selected by the other 6 board members from Nevada. The voting requirements vary with the type of action the board is taking. Next slide. There are 6 standing committees of the governing board listed on the slide. There are also advisory bodies that provide recommendations to TRPA. The board has delegated leadership of some groups like this Tahoe Living Working Group and the Threshold Update Initiative Stakeholders Working Group to the Planning Commission. The Tahoe Living Working Group is a subcommittee of the Planning Commission. Next slide. These groups are engaged in the Cultivating Communities Project, the governing board, and their regional planning committee. The Tahoe Living Working Group was formally created by the board with leadership delegated to the APC. It's intended to bring a broad range of perspectives to the policymaking process. And since it was formally created, it can make formal recommendations to the Planning Commission and board. The Community Partner Group was not created through a formal action of the board or APC and has been convened to advise staff not to take formal action. The Community Partner Group is made up of community-based organization leaders. So at this point, we've covered some of the background and structure of the agency. We're going to take a little pause for questions before getting into the planning system and the nuts and bolts of TRPA operations. Jacob, do we have any questions before we go to the next part?
Yeah, we have one question, and I think I can answer this one. So the question is, how are we going to utilize the IEC or the environmental documents from the 2012 regional plan when you know, incomes have increased, conditions have changed since that time? And the answer to that is really that we're not going to be tearing off of the 2012 regional plan environmental document. We'll be doing an EIS, and we have budgeted to do an EIS for this Cultivating Community project.
If there aren't any other questions, we ready for the next slide?
Just a reminder to have people put their questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
And we have another question that just came in, a follow-up question on my question of on my answer of what is an EIS. I'm sorry, I didn't spell that out. And an EIS is an environmental impact statement. It is the highest level of environmental review that we do on projects or policy amendments as an agency. So it's the highest standard of review. We use it for very large projects, for regional plan updates, major policy changes, and that's what we plan on doing for this for this project.
Okay, we ready for the next slide?
I got one more question that came in.
Okay.
Actually, we got 2 questions. One question I'll give to you, John Hester. Where can you find a list of the members of these committees?
It should be on our website, and if it's not, we'll check, but if it's not, then we will make sure that it gets put on the website.
Okay, thank you. And there was another question on who is the Community Partner Group. You covered that a little bit, and I can explain a little more. The Community Partner Group is a group of leaders of community-based organizations around the basin that are advising staff on the elements of inequity and trying to create a more inclusive, equitable process than we've had before. So, and yes, we can we can share a list of the CBOs that are part of that group in the chat. We'll share that in the chat.
Okay, now are we ready?
I think we're ready. I think the rest of our folks,
Okay,
our helpers here can answer the questions in the chat. So go
Okay.
right ahead, John.
okay, next slide, implementing the compact. The TRPA bi-state compact requires the development of threshold standards. These are standards meant to represent important values like clean water and air and public safety. TRPA goes about attaining and maintaining these standards through several functions authorized by the compact, and TRPA's authority is the federally designated Water Quality Management Planning Agency and the federally designated Metropolitan Planning Organization for Transportation Planning and Funding. So TRPA is not only the bi-state organization created by the compact, it is also the Water Quality Planning Agency and the Transportation Planning Agency. So based on the regional plan and code, TRPA reviews and permits development and redevelopment projects, transportation projects, and environmental projects. Put another way, all projects that must get a permit must meet the requirements of the regional plan and code. Sometimes this is referred to as TRPA's regulatory role. TRPA and partners also provide incentives for various projects and programs. These projects and programs are included in the Federal Transportation Improvement Program or the Environmental Improvement Program. Both of those are known respectively as the TIP and the EIP. The TIP and the EIP include federal, state, local, and private funding for projects. In recent years, this has averaged just below $100 million per year for both the TIP and the EIP, so just below $200 million per year. Next slide. So projects and programs, the EIP has 4 focus areas: watersheds and water quality, which addresses problems like stormwater runoff and erosion and aquatic invasive species. It has transportation and sustainable recreation, which focuses on travel to and from and protection of recreation areas and similar destinations. Forest health, which concentrates on forest management and restoration through practices like thinning. And then science stewardship and accountability, which includes monitoring, reporting on, and updating on the threshold standards. Next slide. There are many things that TRPA can do through its regulatory authority, such as the planning, zoning, and permitting, which I talked about. But there are lots of things we can't do, such as levy taxes. We can't own property except for our own building, and we can't build and operate projects. So the environmental improvement program is an important way that we partner with other entities that can do those things to help get the restoration projects on the ground. That's the collective impact model shown in the slide. Next slide. The TRPA planning framework has multiple components. First, the threshold standards I mentioned previously, and the regional plan, which also encompasses the water quality management plan, and policies from the regional transportation plan. We have a code of ordinances, also known as the TRPA code, which has guidelines and regulations that must be met by permitted projects. I also mentioned that previously. And then we have area plans that can be prepared and adopted by local governments and can cover all or part of a jurisdiction's geographic area that is within the Tahoe Basin. These plans must be consistent with the TRPA regional plan and are adopted by the TRPA board. Next slide. TRPA and local governments have different roles in the planning process, but sometimes they overlap. TRPA sets the higher level regional goals, policies, and regulations, while local governments set building codes and other more detailed policies and regulations for their communities. TRPA reviews all projects that are considered large or in special areas, like along the lakeshore. Local governments can review smaller projects like homes and remodels. Both enforce regulations through compliance programs. And as I mentioned earlier, TRPA can't own land. The agency sometimes helps coordinate public projects, but the public works and emergency services are the responsibility of the local governments. Next slide. Some key features of the regional plan, which had its last major update in 2012, it recognizes that a lot of the environmental impacts are from the older development, which did not or does not meet current standards and can only be addressed by redevelopment and improvements to the infrastructure like better stormwater collection and retention systems. It provides incentives to improve the environment by moving development from more sensitive and remote areas to developed town centers. It also provides a framework for more livable and walkable communities while protecting remote environmentally sensitive areas by reducing the need for auto uses and emissions. Next slide. The redevelopment around Heavenly Village is a real example of the intended results of the regional plan. It's now a more viable community with a nearly 20% reduction in trips and pollution. Next slide. In general, this is how development happens in the basin. The TRPA has some of the strictest development requirements in the country. First, like most areas, a property must have a land use or zoning designation that allows the type of development that is desired. Second, unlike most areas, the property must also have a development right, and there are a limited number of these in the basin. We'll go deeper into development rights in a later presentation. Third, in addition, the amount of property that can be covered is limited to reduce runoff and pollution. In most other areas, these constraints are addressed with stormwater systems. Stormwater systems were generally not required when most of the development in the basin happened in the 1950s and 60s. Finally, even if an applicant has the desired land use or zoning, development rights, and can meet the land coverage requirements, the regional plan and code limit the amount of residential development that can occur in any 2-year period. Next slide. So this slide kind of identifies some of the issues that we've identified through the Tahoe Living Working Group and which are a result of our development requirements. Although there are many reasons for housing affordability and equity issues in the United States, analysis of the planning system in the Tahoe Basin, that is the regional plan, the code, and as they exist today, indicates there is a place for addressing these issues in our planning system. That's the reason TRPA embraces continuous improvement in general and this cultivating community project specifically. Lack of housing is an issue not just for the commute, but also for the lack of critical members of the workforce being here when needed, such as sheriff's deputies and emergency workers. So we've got a lot of issues to address. Let me switch now to the next slide. So based on the compact and the transportation planning legislation, TRPA the board regularly decides high priority focus areas, which we call strategic priorities. We're on a 4-year cycle for by the compact and transportation planning legislation. The current set of strategic priorities are shown on the slide. They are transportation, housing, and community revitalization in the environmental improvement program. Cultivating community is the current phase of the Tahoe Living Initiative. You can go to tahoeliving.org for more information and background on current and previous phases. Next slide. That's it for me, so I'll turn it back to you, Jacob.
Thank you, John. And thank you everyone for joining us. So a quick reminder before I open up the questions. This was the first in a series of educational presentations. So if there's something you want to learn more about that's related to planning for housing in the Tahoe Basin, please let us know. We've got this survey link. I'll have my colleagues throw it in the chat. There's also a QR code right here on your screen that you can use to access the survey, where you can share some of your ideas for potential future learnings. And we hope to see you at Planning 101. That's again on February 10th at 3 p.m. That's also a Monday. We hope to see you and many more there. I think it'll be a really interesting presentation. So you'll be able to find this presentation recorded along with some other past presentations that may be interesting and relevant to cultivating community at tahoeliving.org. And you can also sign up for the housing e-news there to get the latest on cultivating community and housing at Lake Tahoe. We also encourage you to check out the Incline Village Crystal Bay Community Business Association's Workforce Housing webinar series. And so you can go to ivcba.org for more information on that. And with that, I'll take a look. Let's see what questions we got here. It looks like we got a few. So I'll start with this one for John. The question is, so it says TRPA asks the Nevada legislature to allow taxing authority for an additional tax in the basin. How does that align with TRPA's authority?
Well, TRPA can ask on behalf of taxing entities for them to have an enabling legislation is what I call it. So for example, in the next legislative session, we've asked the Nevada legislature to pass a bill that would allow local governments to charge a fee on larger housing developments to help fund infrastructure for smaller housing. So we can't tax, we don't have taxing authority, but we can, on behalf of our local governments, request bills either in the Nevada legislature or the California legislature, or they can. All of them are designed to help implement the regional plan and attain and maintain thresholds.
Okay, we got another one, and this is a great question that we hear often. So, where does wildfire evacuation and security of residents and tourists play into TRPA's strategic priorities?
So it's probably the best way to think about it is in the environmental improvement program. What that strategic priority is about includes forest health. And the way we like to look at that is how can we increase the pace and scale of environmental improvement projects, and specifically in forest health. One of the things that our local emergency service providers, the fire service providers, have asked is that we focus on thinning the forest around evacuation routes. We are also looking at changing our development pattern to work better. Transit to help communities where they don't have cars or good communication systems is something we're working on with a grant we actually got through our transportation planning authority, but we're trying to use that grant also for the intelligent transportation systems and emergency communications. And then the last thing that is probably the biggest area that we can work on, that especially after you see what has happened recently in the LA fires, is hardening. We've worked on the wildland urban interface, but we can probably look at hardening structures so they're not as fire prone. And that will probably happen more through the two states' building codes and as they get adopted and applied by local governments. Like I said in my presentation, we don't issue building permits, but they probably, I anticipate hardening will be built into the building codes of both states and the local governments in the basin. So I hope that was a lot, but I hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, a lot to say on that topic, and I know a lot of folks, really everyone in the basin is thinking about it. So thank you. This is another great question. Curious, how does TRPA interact with the Tahoe Water Suppliers Association? What's our relationship with that group?
They are a stakeholder in a lot of different things that we do. Give you an example. We recently did an experiment of different methods to eradicate the weeds in the Tahoe Keys, and they were a very key stakeholder because they were very concerned, rightfully so, about the impacts of different tests on water supply. So we involve them a lot. They are also involved, as are the public safety providers, in going after EIP funding for water projects. And we specifically in recent years have looked to increase the flow for fighting fires, which goes back to your previous question as well. So they're a very valued stakeholder.
Another question asks, when will you discuss short-term rentals? John, do you want to talk a little bit about TRPA's role in short-term rentals?
Sure. We had this question come up a few years ago to the board. And what we talked about, we went to the local governments committee and we said, we'd like to hear what you are doing. The whole board would like to hear what you're doing. And then hear your proposals on how to address those. As a result, what we did was we changed our code. So I mentioned in development, you need allocations. We changed our code so that allocations are now based on three things instead of two. The two they used to be based on were compliance with water quality regulations from both states and water quality crediting, and how well you permitted when you were permitting things on our behalf. In other words, you were permitting using our code. And then we added the third one, which was, do the local governments have a short-term rental program that talks about location and enforcement and information? And if you do not have all those components, we limit your allocations. Now there's been discussion about revisiting the short-term rental topic as part of this phase of Tahoe Living Working Group. So I'm sure we will have discussions on that. In looking at it in the past, what we've heard from the local governments and what our board decided was one size doesn't fit all at the regional level. So some of the local governments have location requirements that their voters have imposed. Some of them use resources from that to provide housing and transit. So each local government has a different way they approach it. So that's why we didn't really do anything more than limit allocations if you didn't have a program. So that's where we are on short-term rentals, and it could, like I said, could be a topic as we move forward.
Thanks, John. And I just wanted to let folks know that we're having some issues with the survey link. So for anyone who wants to fill out the survey, we'll send it out. We'll send you out a new link. Once we get that fixed, send it out to everyone who's in attendance today. So sorry for the inconvenience. Another question for you, John. So the question is, how can we understand the hierarchy of laws that TRPA operates with? When does TRPA supersede local government, and when does local law take precedent? So I know we've got a slide on this. John, could you go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah, I'll try without trying to say what we said earlier in a different way. In a bi-state compact, both states say we're going to give up some authority over planning and permitting, and they can give up authority on other things too. But in this case, they gave up authority over planning and permitting to the bi-state agency. So the bi-state agency has takes precedence over what the local governments can do. Now, they can also still impose the standards. For example, the state of California has what they call Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, numbers that they apply to the local governments. Nevada doesn't. So the RHNA requirements still apply to the California jurisdictions in the basin, but they don't to Nevada. TRPA doesn't have those requirements on either side, but TRPA does have, for example, I mentioned the coverage requirements. So those coverage requirements, everybody has to meet regardless, because that's part of our planning system. Local governments can adopt stricter regulations if they would like, but they can't adopt a regulation that's less strict than TRPA's. We have the compact says that everything that happens in the basin has to be permitted by TRPA unless we say it's exempt from permitting. So you might hear of or qualified exempt, which means that they can let us know about it, but they don't need a permit. So you may hear, if you pay close attention to some of our activities, you may hear us say, well, that's a qualified exempt activity, or that's an exempt activity. That means you don't need a permit. We also have, when a local government adopts an area plan that our board has found consistent and adopted, consistent with the regional plan and adopted. We have MOUs or memorandum of understanding. So with those, we can say to a local government, use your area plan and you can issue permits for some of the things we would have issued permits for had you not had your area plan. We also have MOUs with for certain size projects with the departments of transportation, with utilities and that sort of category of users. So that's probably a lot of detail, but basically the hierarchy is the compact supersedes planning and permitting regulations of the two states. And then the two states can have their own as long as they're not less strict. And we can, through more detailed area plans, delegate some of that permitting authority to locals. I don't know if that covered all the topics that you could talk all day probably about the compact and how it relates to different organizations and so forth. But I think that hopefully that gives you a little bit of more of an overview.
Yeah, thanks, John. And maybe our colleagues in the chat can share a link that you know, to the TRPA webpage that describes the compact. That might help shed a light on this. But we've got a lot of great questions related to evacuation that I want to get to. But before, just on the subject of TRPA's jurisdiction, there's a question. Does TRPA regulate gaming?
No.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, I think this is a really interesting question. It's asking, evacuation is about exiting the basin on established roads. Are these roads under the environmental improvement program? What are your thoughts on the relation really between evacuation and the environmental improvement program? Where's the overlap there?
Well, first of all, we are not the agency responsible for evacuation. That happens with the local law enforcement and fire services. They work together to do that, and they plan that. They do a lot of training on that. They actually have issued an evacuation plan recently. So we don't actually plan or carry out evacuations. What we do is work with the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team and the coordinating committee on what can we do on the planning realm to try to help set up more successful evacuations. So what we've heard that we can do is thin the forest around the evacuation routes. So the EIP includes forest thinning projects and prioritizes them. So what the EIP, right now, we're looking at where we should prioritize forest thinning projects around those evacuation routes. And there's burn piles, also getting rid of those burn piles. And so that's kind of our role in terms of evacuation in the EIP. We will, through this grant I mentioned a minute ago, we will be looking at transportation infrastructure from the broader natural hazards or climate resiliency perspective. And it's not just will the transportation system work in an evacuation, but from fire, but will it work during snow emergencies? Will it work during floods? There's a lot of other natural hazards that we're susceptible to in the Tahoe Basin. So we want to look at the transportation infrastructure. Is it susceptible to earthquakes, et cetera? So we will be looking at that. And that's not just for evacuation, that's for being able to get around during and after natural hazard events. So again, hope that answers the question, and you could talk a long time about that as well. And if we want to follow up on that, we have our Environmental Improvement Department Director, Kat McIntyre, is an honorary member of the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team, and she could talk all day about it, and so could the fire chiefs.
Thanks, John. While we're on the subject, could you explain a little bit about what you mean by home hardening and how that relates to
Sure.
fire prevention?
Sure. What I mean by home hardening is that you, if you think about it, if you had wood shakes, shingles, or wood siding, or something like that, that an ember could, or heat could just cause to burn quicker. Hardening is the process of changing the building materials and building design so that it's the home is hardened, or it's less likely to burn. The first kind of line of defense is the wildland urban interface. We have guidelines for clearing around houses, but also hardening is something where you do roof materials that aren't as flammable, or you do siding or different materials on the sides of the house. Even the way that it pulls air in and out of the house to cool it and heat it can be changed to make the house less susceptible to fire. So those are the kind of things that, and they will show up in building codes. And even I think recently some people have shared pictures of homes being built by 3D printers out of things like concrete. So that's not something necessarily that's in our plans or code, but that's an example of hardening that people are talking about now.
Yeah, that's about the most literal example of home hardening that I've seen. So while we're on the subject of what you can do to your property here in the basin, there's a question here that asks, can TRPA help private property owners financially to rehabilitate SEZ areas on their property? And if not, are there any programs for that?
We do have some EIP projects that are about watershed restoration. And so they're usually fairly large projects, like the Upper Truckee River Restoration Project that's being done by partners. We also work with the local governments on retrofitting for, I mentioned stormwater systems instead of land coverage. We're working on a few projects like that with the local governments. We don't have any direct funding sources ourselves, but if you talk with us, I'm sure we can connect you with at least the appropriate local government, and maybe we know of some grant programs you can get through the local government or otherwise, but we don't have a direct funding for that ourselves.
Thanks. What about removing rusting metals from the lake? Are there any efforts to take care of iron or other rusting metals that are in the lake?
Yeah, there was, I'm trying to remember the name of the group that was volunteer scuba divers that went around the entire lake here recently. We also just recently permitted the removal of the AT&T lead cables. So there are some efforts to do that. We don't do it ourselves, but there are others who are trying to do that. And I think groups like the Tahoe Fund and the League to Save Lake Tahoe, so League to Save Lake Tahoe are also helping with groups that do that.
So this next question, I think, is a really good one and really directly related to what we're thinking about with cultivating community, particularly with regard to development rights. So thank you for the person who asked it. When establishing the residential unit pool and cap, so both for bonus units and market rate units, was there a specific size of home that was assumed as part of that environmental analysis?
Well, what we did was we assumed all homes were the same. And that's one of the areas that tentatively has been identified as one we should really look at in this next phase of the Tahoe Living Working Group. I'll give you an example. Say a 10,000 square foot house, which we have some that big and bigger on the lakeshore, requires one residential development right. And a 1,000 square foot home in an apartment complex or condominium complex requires one residential development right. And you get the same thing going on with mitigation fees. And what has become clear in the analysis that's been done in the earlier phases is that those really should be scaled to the size of the house. The mitigation fee should be bigger if it's a bigger home, and the number of development rights required should be bigger, because if not, we're encouraging larger single-family homes that are usually on larger lots further away from the developed areas that we're trying to concentrate development in, for vehicle miles traveled reduction and to create more viable communities. So that is something we definitely want to look at. I mentioned legislation earlier. Somebody asked about taxing authority, and I said we don't have taxing authority, but one of the pieces of legislation that are working with the Nevada legislature on is, can we also make those mitigation fees scalable, even though we don't charge them, or the hookup fees, sorry, even though we don't charge them, can the local governments who have hookup fees make them scalable? And can they use the fees from big houses to subsidize small, or big units to subsidize small units? So yes, development rights and the fees that go with them, definitely something we need to look at.
Thanks, John. So back to evacuation. We have a question here. Don't you think that allowing max density, maximum coverage, and no parking will negatively impact our ability to evacuate? How would you respond to the impacts of increasing density, increasing coverage, decreasing parking, how that impacts our ability to evacuate in an emergency?
Sure. Well, first I want to make clear a couple things. Density is different than the maximum number of units. So if you had 100 units spread out in 100 single-family houses all over an area, that's different than 100 units in a couple buildings. So it's the same number of units, it's just how they're configured. So if you have those spread out, it's harder to provide fire protection to those if they're spread out than if they're closer together. Evacuation, if you have one car per single family home, or a couple cars per single family home spread out, that's going to cause you a lot more traffic when you evacuate than if you have a vehicle like a bus or a couple buses go to some of the buildings with more units in it, and you can put more people in a bus. There's lots of good information on, and actually the California Attorney General talks about it's preferable to have higher density on evacuation routes that are served by transit. Now, we probably need better transit than we have, but we're working on that. But I think in terms of the land use, given the same amount of development, which is what we're talking about, we're not talking about more development, we're talking about the capped amount of development rights we have now. Most people who've looked at this would say a higher density with transit, higher density in concentrated areas with transit service is better for evacuation. That's also part of what we're doing with that PROTECT grant that I mentioned, that talks about intelligent transportation systems and reaching the underserved communities. And most good evacuation plans talk about how you can use fleets like school district fleets and private transportation fleets, the public transportation fleets. By fleets, I mean buses, and where you deploy them during an emergency to evacuate. All that said, Tahoe, like many other places, is very susceptible to wildfire, and it always will be. And so we need to, do the best we can and try to create the development pattern that's less susceptible, the hardening, all of those things that are less susceptible. As long as people want to live here, we're going to have that risk.
Thank you, John. I think we're coming to the end of the questions here. I do have one last one that I'll ask you before we get into our conclusion and and the little technical things we have to do to conclude a Tahoe Living Working Group meeting. But the question here asks, you use the example of 100 units at high density versus 100 units at low density. So 100 units concentrated in a small area versus spread out over a large area. And this question asks, where is the offset for 100 units in a town center? Does that mean that 100 units are removed from outside of the town center? How does that work?
There are only about in the neighborhood of 3,000 residential units left, or maybe 4,000. Sorry, I don't have the exact number in my mind right now, but there's only a limited amount of units left. So they can either come from the amount of unbuilt units, which are property rights people have, or they can come from moving development. And we provide part of our development rights system, and I know we're going to have another webinar on this, so I don't want to get too much in detail, but we have a system that's called Transfer of Development Rights, or TDR. And so if you move a development right from an area that is sensitive, like in a stream environment zone, like where the Motel 6 is coming down at South Shore, you will get bonus development rights that are part of that cap, part of that pool, that you can get if you move it out of a sensitive area or out of a remote area to an area that we prefer to have it in. So the development rights would come from either moving from a remote or a sensitive or remote and sensitive area, or from the unbuilt development that's left. Or if another funding source comes along to buy down some development rights so that there's less development, like has happened in the Burton-Santini Act and the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act and the Nevada Division of State Lands, or the California Tahoe Conservancy can actually buy development rights from people, and so that development will not happen. And they've done that, I think, about 10,000 parcels, if my numbers are right, 10%, sorry, 10% of the development in the basin, the development rights have been purchased by public money, so that development won't happen. But we can't just take them, because we can't take development rights away from people. Property rights are one of the reasons there was a revolution back here in 1776, because they were being taken without compensation. So we can't take them, but if there's funding sources, they can be bought, or we can transfer them, but there's a limited amount. It's probably more than the questioner wanted to know, but that's how the development rights system works and how you move them around. And I don't want to say anything more because people won't tune into the development rights webinar.
Yeah, I don't. Please, John, leave some for Development Rights 101 or Growth Management 101. That's coming in late March, and we'll announce the date for that later. Hopefully by next month we'll have a date. So I told you that was the last question, but I lied. Sorry, John. There's one more question. This is a good one, so I wanted to bring it forward. The questioner asks, STRs or states STRs are a commercial use. Could TRPA put restrictions on STRs and keep them in areas that are better situated for commercial uses, like along roads with transit routes?
Well, as some of the local governments have done just that.
Right, the city did.
Yeah, the city did, and you can regulate those in the local area plans. Some people consider them commercial uses, others don't. And really the dividing line seems to be that you can rent your house, but if you rent it for a shorter period of time, it becomes a short-term rental instead of a long-term rental. And I think the question that we want to probably look at, and I mentioned this earlier, in terms of housing is is this an untapped resource? Can you take somebody's house that they have that they're using to get income from short-term rental? Can you convince them, can we create a situation where it's just as beneficial for them to put that in the housing stock for longer-term rentals? I think there's some programs we've looked at and that are smaller but could be bigger, called leasing to locals, I think was the name of the program. And so those are the kind of things we need to look at. And where they go is one of the things we ask the local governments to do when they put their short-term rental programs together, so that each community can work with the people in their community and say, where do we want them and where do we not want them? And so that's one of those items that our board in the past has says a one size fits all isn't the solution. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think it really gets into the complexity and the pros and cons of any decision that we make in planning. And we'll get more to this in Planning 101, which is coming up next month, February 10th. But when you choose to put STRs in commercial areas, then you're running the risk of losing valuable commercial space as well, which is important to our community as well. So I think it gets into some of the challenges of the decisions that planners make in consultation with the community and with, of course, the decision makers. So with that, we're running out of time here. We still got some items to close up. So hopefully everyone has either gotten a written or a verbal answer to their questions. And remember, we'll have more opportunities for this discussion in the future. So thank you, John, for the presentation and the great answers to these good people's questions. And now I'm going to move, Jessica, could you advance the slides one? So we've got some finishing items for Tahoe Living Working Group members. If you're on the working group, please stick around. If you're not, you're welcome to stay, but you're also welcome to leave if you'd like. So to start off, I'll just ask if there are any additional working group comments. Working group members, you can raise your hand if you have a comment, and I'll call on you. All right, not okay. Catherine is telling me that Erica Gonzalez has her hand raised. I can't see that. Is there a way that we can promote panel? Oh, here we go. Erica, are you there?
I was unmuted, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So right now we're answering comments about this training. Is that what you're seeking?
Yeah, exactly. We'll also take general comments, but comment on this training is what we're asking for. Yeah.
Okay. I am a little confused about the disparate connection between the Q&A and the substantive content. The substantive content was supposed to be a TRPA 101, and the Q&A is so far advanced that I was lost for half of the training. I think and I am also very concerned that we were rushing even to start this without double checking that the interpreter stuff was actually working. It felt all very rushed to get to Q&A that were disconnected from the topics that we were here to discuss. And that's, as a result, we can't see all the questions. So we don't even know what questions we missed that were related to this TRPA 101. I am concerned moving forward on the planning of this. And one of my big comments has been community engagement. This feels very detached. And I just want to flag that. And I'll put more detailed comments in the follow-up email, but I wanted to flag that on the record.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Any other comments?
I did not see any more hands raised.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Jessica, can you move to the next slide? Public interest comments. Anyone from the public have a comment that they would like to make on the record? Raise your hand.
Jacob, would you like me to manage?
Yeah, Catherine, you're the pro at this, so yeah, please do.
Yeah, Kathy, Julian, go ahead and make your comment, please.
Yes, well, as a member of the public, I thought that the question and answer period was very interesting and useful. So I just wanted to go on record saying that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Any more raised hands, Catherine?
There are no other hands raised to make a comment.
She says it so naturally. All right, Jessica, could you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, and so we've reached adjournment. So I can do that. I'll say it's 3:02 p.m. January 27th, and this meeting of the Tahoe Living Working Group is adjourned. Thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing you next month for our presentation on the fundamentals of planning, Planning 101. Bye-bye.